I came home on a Tuesday evening to find a padlock on the door of my own study. Not a broken latch, not a sticky handle. A brand new, shiny brass padlock, the kind you buy at Canadian Tire for $15, clamped onto the door of the room where I had graded papers for 22 years, where I kept my late husband's journals, where every photograph of our life together sat on the shelves exactly where I had placed them. I stood in the hallway for a long moment. I didn't say anything. I didn't knock on my son's bedroom door to demand an explanation. I simply stood there, stared at that padlock, and felt something shift inside me, not break, not crack, shift. Like a tectonic plate that had been under pressure for a very long time, finally deciding it had held long enough. I set my grocery bags down on the kitchen counter, made myself a cup of tea, and sat at the table where I had fed my children breakfast for 30 years. And I smiled, because I had been waiting for a sign. And there it was, hanging on my door, shining under the hallway light. My name is Loretta Beauchamp. I am 63 years old. I am a retired registered nurse who spent 31 years working at a hospital in Ottawa, and before that, I raised 2 children in this house, the house my husband Robert and I bought in 1987 for $112,000. The house where my daughter Simone took her first steps on these hardwood floors. The house where my son Etienne learned to ride his bike in the driveway out front. Robert passed away 6 years ago. Pancreatic cancer. He was gone in 4 months from diagnosis to burial, and the speed of it nearly destroyed me. But I kept the house. I kept working 2 more years after he died, and then I retired with my pension, my savings, and my dignity intact. I want you to understand something before I continue. I was not a bitter woman. I was not lonely in the way people assume a widow must be. I had my garden in the summer. I had my book club on Wednesday evenings. I had Simone, who called me every Sunday without fail and drove up from Kingston 3 or 4 times a year. I had a life, a full, quiet, satisfying life in the home I owned outright. When Etienne called me 2 years ago to tell me that he and his wife Kristen were having trouble making rent in their apartment in Gatineau, I didn't hesitate. I told him to come home, both of them. I had the space. Etienne was my son. Family takes care of family, that was something Robert used to say, and I believed it with my whole heart. What I did not understand, and what I want to be honest about, is that I did not know Kristen well. Etienne had been with her for 3 years before they married, and during that time I had perhaps spent 40 or 50 hours total in her presence. She was polite at Christmas dinners. She asked appropriate questions. She complimented my cooking. I thought she was simply a quiet person, a private person, the way some people are. I was wrong about that. The first month they moved in was fine. Better than fine, honestly. It was nice to hear footsteps in the house again. Nice to smell someone else's coffee brewing in the morning. Etienne helped me fix the loose step on the back porch that I'd been meaning to repair for 2 years. Kristen reorganized the spice cabinet, which I hadn't asked her to do but didn't mind. We were finding our rhythm, I thought. The second month, small things began to happen. The living room furniture moved about 1.5 feet to the left. Not dramatically, just enough that the whole room felt slightly wrong to me, the way a painting hung crooked feels wrong even when you can't immediately identify why. When I mentioned it to Etienne, he said Kristen found the old arrangement made the room feel smaller. I said I had lived in this room for 35 years and found it perfectly comfortable. He said it wasn't a big deal, Mom. Then the photographs. Robert and I had wedding photos on the wall of the upstairs hallway, our anniversary trip to Newfoundland in 2003. A picture of all 4 of us, Etienne, Simone, Robert, me, at Simone's university graduation. These photographs had been on that wall for years, and I walked past them every morning and every evening and every time I went upstairs for anything, and I cannot explain to you adequately what it meant to me to walk past them. One Saturday I came upstairs to find them gone. Not moved, gone. In their place were 3 large framed prints, the kind you order from an online shop in gray and white tones, abstract shapes, very modern, the sort of thing you see in hotel lobbies. They were not ugly, but they were not my family. I found my photographs in a box in the hall closet, wrapped in newspaper. I asked Kristen about it that evening, calmly. I want to be clear that I asked calmly. She said the hallway needed updating, that the old photos made the space feel cluttered. She said it with the same tone you might use to discuss whether to buy 1% or 2% milk, completely matter of fact. I looked at my son. He was looking at his phone. I took the box of photographs to my study, where they would be safe, and I said nothing more that night. But I want you to understand what was happening inside me. I had been a nurse for 31 years. I spent 3 decades learning to stay calm in situations that would make other people panic. I learned very early that the moments when you most want to raise your voice are often the moments that most require you to lower it. So I stayed calm. I observed. I waited. What I was observing was a pattern. Kristen was not making herself at home in my house. She was making my house her home. There is a difference, and it is not a subtle one. By the 4th month, she had replaced the kitchen curtains beige linen I had hung 15 years ago with white roller blinds. She had removed the ceramic rooster that sat on the windowsill beside the sink, a piece I had bought at a craft fair in Almonte the summer Simone was 7 years old. When I asked where the rooster was, she said she had put it in the garage because it was taking up counter space. My rooster. On my counter. In my kitchen. She had also begun referring to the house, in conversation, as our place. As in, I'm having a few friends over to our place on Saturday. As in, we should really repaint the dining room, our place needs some freshening up. The first time I heard her say it, I told myself I was being sensitive. The second time, I thought perhaps it was simply a speech habit, the way some people say we when they mean something looser than they intend. By the 5th or 6th time, I knew it was neither of those things. I also noticed, around this time, that Kristen had begun handling questions about the house with contractors, with delivery people, with a neighbor who came by about the property line, as though she were the homeowner and I were a guest who happened to be present. In November, a man came to give an estimate on replacing the roof. I was home. He rang the doorbell. Kristen answered it, walked him around the exterior of the property, sat down with him at the kitchen table, and discussed the project for 45 minutes while I sat in the living room. When he left, she came in and told me the estimate and said she thought we should go with him. I said, with as much patience as I could locate within myself, that I would look at the estimate and make my own decision about my own roof. She looked at me with an expression I can only describe as mild surprise, as though I had said something slightly unreasonable. I called Simone that evening. Simone, who is sharp and careful and does not easily alarm, listened to everything I said and was quiet for a moment afterward. Then she said, "Maman, I think you need to document this. Not because anything criminal was happening," she explained, "but because patterns matter and it is useful to have a record." So I started keeping notes. Dates, incidents, exact words when I could remember them. I am a retired nurse. I know how to keep clinical notes. I know how to be precise. December came and went. January. The house continued to shift around me in small ways. A new bath mat I didn't buy, a different brand of dish soap that appeared under the sink. My gardening books moved from the shelf in the sunroom to a box in the basement to make room for Kristen's collection of home design magazines. And then, in the middle of February, Kristen asked me very casually, over breakfast, whether I had thought about eventually moving into something smaller. I looked up from my coffee. She said she was only asking because, practically speaking, the house was quite large for one person. She said this even though there were 3 of us living in it. She said a condo might be easier for me to manage, less maintenance, more social activities. She mentioned a development near Bell's Corners that she'd seen advertised. I said, with great care, that I was 63 years old, in excellent health, and that I had no plans to leave my home. She nodded, as though she had noted my answer, and changed the subject. I finished my coffee, I washed my cup. I went to my study and I sat down at my desk and I thought about my husband, who had sat at this same desk for 20 years. And I thought about my children learning to walk on these floors. And I thought about 35 years of life that had happened inside these walls. And then I called a lawyer. Not because I was in immediate danger of losing anything. My name was on the title. I was the sole owner of this property. There was no legal mechanism by which Kristen could take this house from me. But I had been a nurse long enough to know that you do not wait for a crisis to prepare for one. The lawyer I called was a woman named Patricia Osei, who had been referred to me by a colleague years ago. I explained the situation. She listened carefully. She advised me to make sure all important documents were stored somewhere outside the home: my will, the property title, financial records. She also recommended I consult with an estate lawyer about updating my will, which had not been touched since Robert died. I made an appointment for the following week. I updated my will. I made Simone the executor. I also made some changes to the distribution of assets that I will describe shortly. In the meantime, I also had a security camera installed, the small, discreet kind, positioned in the upstairs hallway where my photographs used to hang. I told no one. And then came the Tuesday evening in March when I came home from having dinner with 2 friends from my old ward at the hospital, walked down my hallway, and found a padlock on the door of my study. My study. The room that contained my husband's journals, the photographs I had moved there for safekeeping, my financial files, my personal correspondence. The rocking chair Robert had refinished himself the winter before he got sick. I stood at that door and I thought, there it is. The next morning, I got up at 5:30, which is my usual time. I dressed, I went to the kitchen and made coffee. And then, at 6 in the morning, while my son and his wife were asleep, I went to the garage and I found the bolt cutters I had purchased 3 weeks prior and placed in my toolbox for exactly this purpose. I removed the padlock. I set it on the hallway floor. I went into my study. I sat down. I took out a piece of paper and a pen, not a printer, a pen, because some things deserve to be handwritten, and I wrote. I want to tell you what I wrote, because I think the words matter. I wrote, "This is my home," not in anger, not an accusation, just that fact, standing alone at the top of the page the way a title stands above a document. I wrote about Robert, and how we had chosen every room of this house together, and how his memory lived in these walls in a way that no abstract print could replace, and no padlock could contain. I wrote about Etienne not unkindly. I wrote that I loved my son without condition, that I had loved him since the moment he was born, and that loving him did not require me to surrender my home, or my dignity, or my late husband's journals. I wrote that I had consulted a lawyer. I wrote that my will had been updated. I wrote that the house would go to Simone, along with the majority of my estate, and that this decision was final and had been filed with my lawyer and was not subject to renegotiation. I wrote that I was giving them 60 days to make other arrangements. And I wrote, at the bottom, something that I had been thinking about for weeks, something that felt true in the way that only the simplest things feel true. You cannot build your future in someone else's present. This house is my present. I hope you find one of your own. I signed it with my full name, Loretta Ann Beauchamp. I folded it and wrote Kristen's name on the outside. I left it on the kitchen table, and I went back to my study and closed the door. I heard them wake up around 7:30. I heard the kettle. I heard the silence that follows the opening and reading of a letter that changes the shape of a morning. I heard Kristen's voice, low and controlled. I heard my son's voice, also low, for a long time. At 8 o'clock, Etienne knocked on my study door. I said, "Come in." He sat down across from me. He looked, I thought, like a man who had been asleep for 2 years and was only now beginning to understand that. He didn't look angry. He looked tired and young and a little ashamed, and I want to be clear that I felt no satisfaction in that. He was still my son. He would always be my son. He said he didn't know about the padlock. He said this quietly. And I believed him, because Etienne has never been a good liar, not since he was 9 years old and tried to convince me he hadn't eaten the last of the maple cookies, with crumbs still on his shirt. He said he was sorry. He said he didn't know things had gotten to this point. I said, gently, that I thought perhaps he hadn't been paying attention, and that not paying attention is a choice, even when it doesn't feel like one. He was quiet for a moment. Then he asked if there was any way I would reconsider the 60 days. I said no. He nodded. He looked at the photograph on my desk, the one of him and Simone and Robert and me at the Gatineau Park when the children were small, the 4 of us in autumn light. He looked at it for a long time. Then he said, "I'm sorry, Maman." And I said, "I know. I love you. Now go figure out what comes next." The weeks that followed were not simple. I want to be honest about that. There were tense evenings. There were conversations that went in circles. Kristen did not speak to me directly for the first week after the letter, which suited me well enough. Etienne began looking at apartments. He found one in Nepean, a 2-bedroom, reasonable rent, available April 1st. Simone drove up from Kingston the second weekend of March. She helped me rehang Robert's photographs in the hallway. The abstract prints went into a box, which Kristen took with her when she left. The ceramic rooster came back from the garage and went back to the windowsill beside the sink, where it belongs. On the last day of March, Etienne and Kristen loaded a moving truck in the driveway. It took most of the morning. I made sandwiches and left them on the counter not as a peace offering, exactly, but because feeding people is something I do instinctively, the way you breathe. Kristen didn't take one. Etienne took 2 and thanked me. Before he got in the truck, he hugged me for a long time. He said he was going to call more. I said I would be glad if he did. I stood at the front door and watched the truck pull out of the driveway. Then I went inside, put the kettle on, and stood in my kitchen in the quiet of my own home, and for the first time in 22 months, every room in that house felt like mine again. I am telling you this because I think there are people who need to hear it, not as a story about anger or revenge or winning something, but as a story about a woman who took her time, who thought carefully, who acted with intention rather than reaction, and who did not give up what was hers simply because someone assumed she would. I want to say something to anyone who finds themselves in a house that no longer feels like home, in a life that has slowly been rearranged without your permission, in a situation where the people who should protect you have chosen, however passively, not to. You are not obligated to make yourself smaller to accommodate someone else's ambition. You are not required to accept a slow erosion of your own life out of a fear of conflict or a desire to keep the peace. Peace that is purchased with your dignity is not peace, it is surrender dressed in polite clothing. And here is the other thing I want to say, because I think it is important, and I did not understand it clearly enough for the first year of all of this. Love does not require you to tolerate disrespect. These are not opposing forces. You can love your son completely and still say, "This is my home, and I will not allow this to continue." You can hold both of those things at once. In fact, the most loving thing I could have done for Etienne, for the man I raised and the man I wanted him to become, was to be clear about what I would and would not accept. Because when we allow people to treat us poorly without consequence, we are not protecting the relationship. We are teaching them that we are available to be treated poorly. And that lesson does no one any good. The house is quiet now. My garden came up beautifully in May. Simone was here for the long weekend in July, and we sat on the back porch and drank wine and talked until midnight, the way we used to before everything got complicated. Etienne calls on Sunday evenings, most weeks. We talk about ordinary things. He sounds better than he did. I think Kristen and I will not be close, and I have made my peace with that. The rocking chair is still in my study, exactly where it should be. And some mornings, in the early quiet before the rest of the street wakes up, I sit in it with my coffee and I feel Robert in the room with me, not in any mystical way, just in the way that beloved places hold the shape of the people who love them, and I think about what it means to have a home, not a property, not an asset, a home. A place that carries your history and holds your memories and reflects, in every room, the life you have actually lived. That is worth protecting. Whatever it takes, whatever the discomfort, whatever the difficult conversations that have to happen first. Protect it, because no one else will do it for you. And you are worth the effort.